Good evening and welcome to tonight's show. We have a nice Sunday night show for you. I will say the subject matter is a bit somber and serious, and I just want to say that right off the bat, it is my intention that we examine it with the utmost respect um, for a lot of reasons. Because it deals with the demise of frontman Bradley Nowell. You can't talk about Sublime's last show without talking about why it was Sublime's last show. Bradley Nowell passing away tragically as he did is the reason why the band ceased to be. And we've talked about it before here on the channel. And, I guess, much in the way that we've examined other bands, what's so interesting about the Sublime story is that it, for the longest time at least, was nothing short of a Shakespearean or Greek tragedy. The idea of this up and coming band from this, subculture of alternative rock that was making this incredibly interesting, fresh, original blend of music where, paradoxically, we're a band that is taking from all these different places and blending it into something that feels original yet derivative of all of its influences, like wearing them on the sleeve, but, creating this fusion that is so fresh and vibrant and bright. You know what I mean? That sort of thing. And ultimately knowing that what they were doing was really special, even when things didn't seem up and up for the band, because there were many years, if you read that book, Portrait of a Punk, they had been anticipating the possibility of Brad's demise long before, he passed away. And so it's the story itself is as interesting as, and the fact that it's a true story, I mean, it's a real story. It's not something that somebody just wrote to try and sound tragic. This is a tragic, true story of I guess the ultimate, there Johnny Thunders, another very famous heroin user. There was a saying that I don't know if he used it or if it was used on him specifically, and the saying was snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. And I think nothing better really sort of encapsulates what happened to the band Sublime. And obviously, since there's a powerful, wonderful healing coda to this Greek / Shakespearean tragedy, in that the son of this fallen dude who was so talented has reached his father's age and has taken his place in his band. And, we're never going to get Sublime back, and we're never going to, that what happened, that tragedy, that trauma is never going to be healed. But like the idea, like that the story had an even happier ending. The sort of happy ending of Sublime is that the melancholy ending of Sublime is that Brad died, but the music exploded, and they were right. They were right. They were geniuses, and people saw their genius, and they had incredible success, even though he didn't get to see it. And that in itself was kind of a sort of a happy ending, in the sense that, there's no happy ending in the end of Sublime, but I just mean in the sense of like the fact that the silver lining is that the album did come out, and the album was a huge success, and a lasting legacy and memorial to the genius of the band, right? And then that ending got happier. It somehow got better when Jake came into the picture, But even when he was, all the way back in 2012 when that footage surfaced of him playing at his dad's grave. I digress. But before all that, there is sort of, again, surrounding the tragedy, this Greek tragedy, is like the mythology of like that final show, the last Sublime show, May 24th, 1996. It's a heavy thing, and it was recorded. It was recorded on video, and it was recorded on, there's audio of it. You can hear the audio very freely, easily, but the video is very hard to come by. There are snippets and there are pictures, and that's about it. And what's so heavy when you listen to that show, you're like, this guy doesn't realize that he's playing, not only is he playing his last show, but this is his last night on Earth, and he has no idea it's his last night on Earth. It's just it's like a heavy notion when you think about it. And some years back, on the anniversary of Brad's death, 20-year anniversary, KUED put out something called Sublime's Last Show, the oral history. So an oral history of that final show on May 24th, 1996. And it came out on May 24th, 2016, the 20th anniversary. It's by Gabe Meline. I don't know, probably butchering that name. And we're going to take a look at it. And it's amazing how, Sublime coming back with Jacob is directly tied to the last show, as we've recently learned, because Jake is, he's doing the press tour now, and they're doing the press tours. And Jake is talking about how he returned to the place of his father, that he'd been back to the place where his father had played his last show, and discovered, people having a recovery meeting in the back room, and the realization that he kind of had in that moment. So what's kind of interesting too is that the tragic aspects also, gave birth to a sort of, this is such a cliche, especially in recovery culture. I'm only laughing because of my, I very familiar with recovery culture. The idea that it's that it was a phoenix. Ultimately, it was a phoenix that rose from the ashes, and that the theater itself is called the Phoenix Theater. So it's kind of amazing that the rebirth of this new, whatever you want to call it, version of Sublime with Jacob comes from the Phoenix Theater, as well as the ending of Sublime, because, and we'll see. And again, listen, this is an oral history. Okay. So, the exact truth and details, I don't know if any of us will ever really know what happened. None of us are going to know what exactly happened that night. We're never going to find out. And the closest we can come is to examine the history as the way that, the people that were there describe it and talk about it, and then the way that it was edited and streamlined for this story by Gabe, and I'm sure that any which one of them who read this article, or, whatever, would just be like, no, that's not, no, they got that wrong and that wrong. So we can't say definitively that anything is like the truest of truths. But that's kind of the way that, as I said, this, we're kind of looking at the mythology of this last show, and that's kind of the way that mythology works. We talk a lot about mythology here. That's not to say that this isn't a historical fact. Of course it is. So we're going to take a look at that. And I just wanted to just preface that, like, we're not here to definitively speak in any kind of fact, because I wasn't there, and the people that, or Gabe, who wrote this, wasn't there. The only people that were there around that time were the people who were interviewed for this thing. So it's kind of like an interesting sort of examination of all of that. And I wanted to do the show 10 days ago, and I kind of was putting it off because I don't know, I was kind of feeling weird about it. Brad's death really impacted me a lot as a teenager, especially when I was 16 years old. I think a lot of Sublime fans feel this way. I was deeply connected to this music, and to know that the guy, the soul, the heart and soul of what the driving force of this music, went out in the way that he did, it had a serious impact on me. It really did, in a big bad way. So I don't know if that's the reason why I was kind of putting off the show, but like I said, addiction is a very serious affliction, and it is a family disease. It's a lot of disease. It's a soul disease. It's a disease of the mind, body, and spirit. And, um, I will say this, I don't talk about this very much, but, I am sober, and, growing up sober, or, when I had gotten sober, one of the things that really always spoke to me and really always, I wouldn't say motivated me, but was a power of example, was Brad's death, and just the notion that you could be the smartest guy in the room, you could have the most talent in the room, and just one fucking time could just take you out. And, I didn't know Brad. None of us knew Brad. None of us fans really, whatever that came after. But I've known a lot of people who have died from that substance, and just in general have died. And it's it's always a different story, but it's always the same story. And it's just so frustrating and crazy. And, yeah. So I just want to say, like, I want to make sure that we're going into this with the utmost respect, and for what this is, and, what happened here. And even if we, the thing about Brad is that, the more I read about him and hear about him in interviews and this, he was a very, he seemed to be like a very, frustrating person at times, and when you hear like the little minutia details of, him trying to clean up, and him having all this, having all the things that he had at stake, and that he just couldn't stay clean. It makes you want to punch a hole in the wall, that sort of thing. So yeah. And then, what happens to people when they die young, or when they die tragically, or they become canonized as saints, and I feel like Bradley Nowell's canonized as like some kind of saint. And I don't think he was a saint at all. I think he was, he was a tortured artist. He was a complicated, tortured artist type of guy who, came from a really, like, he came from a well-off sort of, upbringing, and sung about the gutter, and wanted to sort of live the gutter life, or however you want to call that. He wanted to live the Charles Bukowski kind of life. You know what I mean? He wrote about it. That's what he wrote about. And he tried to live what he wrote about, and it killed him. It killed him. So, I just let's clear the air with that, and get all that out of the way so that way, when we're talking, we know where I stand, and just in general, like, what the vibe is of this show, and what we're, talking about. And if you are struggling, know that, as long as you're still alive, like, it's never too late. It's really not. And I've seen so many people come back from the brink of death. It's an amazing thing when it happens. And so if you think that it's hopeless, it's not hopeless. The only time it becomes hopeless is when you're dead. And that's the amazing thing too, is like, I'll never forget one particular situation. I'll share this, and then we'll digress and move on. One I'll never forget, situation. I don't want to get too detailed. Someone close to me who was struggling with some of these issues, and I'll never forget, like, there were these things that were holding him back from getting out of the dire situation that was slowly killing him. And I'll never forget, like, somebody said to me, because we were trying to figure out what to do, and someone said to me, like, as long as that person's alive, like, there's hope, like, there's a chance that they could get better. And whatever problems they have in life, at least they're alive. Because if they're dead, you can't, like, what does it matter if they're dead? Like, none of it matters anymore. All of it stops, that sort of thing. I'm being a little too cryptic right now. All right, so let me digress, and we'll talk for a quick second. We're going to talk about our sponsor. We're not going to make a big deal about it. We're just going to say Ride Stickers is the sponsor of the Frumess channel. If you need stickers, you can get Ride Stickers. Go to the link down in the description. You go to ridestickers.com/Frumess, Frumess. You can get 200 stickers for $69. They're die cut stickers, so you can get them in all sorts of shapes and sizes, whatever you want. You use a computer guided scalpel to do it. Let's play the nifty little theme song, and then we're going to dive into this oral history here that we have here.
We make stickers, banners, and buttons too, posters and promo cards. There's nothing we can't print for you. From stage backdrops to bass drum heads, we can print on shirts, we can print on hats, we can print on pants. Cheap prices and high quality, quick turnaround times and free shipping. We also offer free artwork support, great customer service, and so much more. RiotStickers.com, Riot Stickers, we are the bomb. RiotStickers.com, Riot Stickers, we are the bomb. RiotStickers.com, Riot Stickers, we are the bomb. RiotStickers.com, Riot Stickers, we are the bomb.
And that is a promise. Okay, let's cue it up, everybody. Let's load her up. Here we go. So as I said, this is from KQED, and it's written by Gabe Meline. I feel like I'm butchering that, even though I'm probably not. And it's from May 24th, 2016. That's what I meant to say, 2016. On May 24th, 1996, Sublime played their last show at the Phoenix Theater in Petaluma. No one knew that it would be their final concert, but no one knew it would be their final concert, but no one knew at the time either that singer Bradley Nowell would be found dead of a heroin overdose the next morning at a motel in San Francisco. Sublime would go on to sell over 17 million records, and for obvious reasons, the final show in Petaluma has attained mythic status. An audio bootleg exists. Legal issues over the still unreleased video footage have continued for years, and snippets of people's memories can still be overheard at parties in and around Petaluma. But only 900 or so people witnessed Nowell's final performance. The rest of Sublime's millions of fans always wanted to know, what was it like? I don't know what the legal issues over the still unreleased footage are. Oh, wow. Oh, that's interesting. This looks like it's a whole, wow. How did I not know about this? All right, hold on. We got a detour real quick. Official statement, Albino Brown versus Sublime, video of Sublime's last show. And this is from January 31st, 1998. Can you believe that? Don't believe the hype regarding the video of Sublime's last show. Please read and understand the following statement. Don't be fooled by Skunk Records' biased emotional appeal, smear campaign, and nonsense more than you understand the facts by actual concrete evidence, not the words. Oh my God, this is really, really dense. All right, I'm going to come back to this because this is like, there's a lot to look over here. So let's stay on track, and we'll spend some time looking at that at another point because it's just too dense. So in any case, there were legal issues, and apparently Mr. Albino Brown has a beef with Sublime management at the time, John Phillips. I don't know. Gabe says, I was there that night, but I left after 4 songs. So Gabe was there. My band played the Warped Tour with Sublime the year before, and I'd gotten my fill of them already, to say nothing of Nowell's impulsive behavior. He once sicked his dog on a skateboarder and expected me to back him up in a beat town, an incident I wrote about here 10 years ago. Wow. How did I've read this before, and I totally, oh, wow. All right, we'll look at that at another time too. All right, so we got some stuff. And sounds like Gabe kind of has an axe to grind with the band already. But hearing everyone's memories since, I've always wondered how the rest of their final show went down. So that's crazy. So the guy who's writing about this was there, left after 4 songs because he was weary of the band, and decided to sort of retrace the steps. That's so interesting. So to mark the anniversary of Sublime's last show in Petaluma, I've decided to put together those memories, stories, and loose threads from regular showgoers, people behind the scenes, and performers on stage. So what we're about to hear in this oral history is from regular showgoers, people behind the scenes, and performers on stage. And it's from a guy who was there, who is not stoked about Sublime, or at least he wasn't when he was writing this. So, does that add to, like, again, we're talking about like the exact accuracy of everything that we're reading. I'm not to say that it shouldn't be considered accurate, but just to understand that there's, with anything, there's always like a bias or a bend in some way, shape, or form. Maybe that there is a little one right here. Stand by your van. But I mean, he's got pretty good sources, because here's Eric Wilson, bassist of Sublime. We had just finished the album. For 2 or 3 years before that, we had gotten a really strong cult following just from playing up and down the coast. We started packing in 2,000 people just from word of mouth before we had any deal with a record company. And on top of that, they were selling 40 ounces to freedom independently out of the trunk of their cars. Everybody knows this story. This is nothing new. But you have to think, like, maybe they had overhead of pressing stuff up, but they weren't dealing with a record label. They were selling tens of thousands of copies directly out of a trunk, and that money was going back into the band. I mean, that's incredible. That's an incredible grassroots distribution strategy. And frankly, a band that had that kind of pull or juice now would be grateful for it, because it's hard with record labels now. This is from Rick Bond, the booking agent, the Tahoe agency, Tahoe agency, Rick Bond. In the time that I worked with them, they made it to every gig. We really tightened up the scene. Brad had gotten clean. From my memory, he had been clean for almost a year. They were going to go to Europe. Brad had a brand new wife and a new baby. I don't know what time that he worked with them, but you always hear stories like, for every really, really great Sublime show, there was like 9 before that were like, and I don't know what the exact numbers were. This is hyperbole, but like for every, couple of good shows, there were a handful of bad ones where they were just loaded, sloppy, things didn't work or click. And that really started to kick into gear after 1992, when the band really became a drug band. They got really into drugs, and they weren't as into, it wasn't what it was before. I don't know what everybody exactly was doing before 92, but 92 was when Brad first started voluntarily making a conscious decision. I want to do heroin because I want to be like a tortured artist type, that sort of thing. And then in terms of like these windows of when Brad was clean, I've read in so many different places, just like, oh yeah, he was clean for this window of time, and then he wasn't, and then he was. And what kind of clean time is that? Being clean off of drugs and alcohol doesn't mean that you're necessarily in a sober state of mind. You could still be very sick, in addiction. So who knows to what degree, where Brad was, even when he was straight, to what degree was he straight? Who knows? But there were these streaks where he was like trying to get himself together. He had Jake, he married Troy. Well, he married Troy a week before he died, but he was they had domesticated. I mean, they were together, right? And they were going to Europe for the first time. And Brad is a history major. He loves reading, avid reader of history, excited to see all the sights. Little Mike says, I don't know who Little Mike is. He's just quoted here. That would have been helpful to know who Little Mike is. I was going to meet him at the Glass House in Pomona. They were supposed to play there the week before. I was going to jump in the van with them and head up the coast, but they canceled the Pomona show. I went down to the club that night, and they were like, nah, they're not coming. I was worried that there had been an OD. All right, Filibuster is, I don't know if Filibuster is a Skunk Records recording artist, but they are definitely within the Skunk circle, Skunk Records circle. I'm guessing that maybe they were on Skunk Records. And this is the guy, Jason Boggs from Filibuster. He said they'd come to Sacramento and opened up for us and played for 30 to 40 people at little dive bars around town. And they'd crash on our floors, but they'd really started to blow up right around the time with, that song that played on KROQ, the one that has Ron Jeremy in the video. I can't say the name. Date, fill in the blank. Tom Gaffey, manager of the Phoenix Theater. We were just starting to see more ska and less punk. My punk crowd was just starting to finally turn 21. Ska was the next thing. The youngsters loved it. Most of our crowd for the Sublime show was under 18 and definitely under 21. So a lot of young people were there. And in terms of so there are different, ska had a bunch of revival movements, right? Historically, ska started in, don't quote me on this. We could go to the Wikipedia. I'm not going to for the sake of brevity here. And if anybody wants to correct me, please do. Ska started it goes like this: ska, rocksteady, and then reggae. Usually people think it's reggae and then rocksteady and then ska. Ska was the first music and has the upbeat rhythm. And, it's, I think, calypso or something kind of vibes in there. And it's from the, Central America, Caribbean kind of area somewhere. In that sort of place, Jamaica and whatnot, Jamaica ska, right? And that was the 50s and 60s, maybe the late 50s into the 60s. And then rocksteady picked up. Rocksteady was like a variation, basically a sort of like a precursor to reggae. And then reggae really came into full effect and, or started to gain prominence in the late 60s and into the 70s, right? And reggae is actually, it's a religious music to an extent, right? Because, reggae, the Rastafarians believe that, what's his face? Tafari is his name. Ras, it means king or something, but Tafari, Selassie, or maybe whatever. Selassie he's the prime minister or the president or the dictator of Ethiopia, something like that. I am butchering this history. And it was believed that he was the second coming of Jesus. And that is what reggae is all about. That's Selassie. And he was known as Ras Tafari. So Tafari is a separate word from Ras, and then that got put together as Rastafari. Rastafari. And that's kind of like a religious music, and that's even slower. And, it's interesting how in all of these sort of musics, the guitar is more of a rhythm instrument and the bass kind of leads things, the bass is kind of like the meat and potatoes. And then, and then Sublime, along with a bunch of other bands, let's not, forget about Fishbone. I mean, there's a bunch of bands that were sort of doing similar sort of things. Or at least we're bridging the gap between punk and ska, found a way to go from, the use ska to bridge reggae and punk, Bad Brains, whatnot. The Bad Brains didn't really do ska. Why did I start talking about? Oh yeah. And then there was, the second wave of ska was in the late 70s into the early 80s, and you had bands like Madness and the Specials, and all that was taking place in England. You Bad Manners, that song Lorraine, great song. Madness is the one that everybody really thinks of. One Step Beyond, great friggin' song. But that was a rhythm that they did not come up with. In fact, Sublime does a version of Doing Time using that same arrangement with the sax. It's really great. It's on Secondhand Smoke, if you haven't heard it. So that's the second wave. And then the third wave of ska starts in the 90s, the early to mid 90s, right? And you had bands even earlier, like you had Operation Ivy, you had Sublime, you had No Doubt, Mighty Mighty Boss Tones, Mustard Plug, Mephistopheles, Fishbone, was there, of course. And all these bands ushered in what was known as the third wave ska revival. Real Big Fish, right? Everybody knows Real Big Fish. And although some Sublime fans are really rather Sublime would take much chagrin with where 311 doesn't really fall into any of the ska stuff, but they were doing, in terms of like, they were doing something very similar with, you know, fusing hip hop and rap and whatnot, and doing all that. Jody Ramone is here. Hi, Jody. How are you? Jody says, I like Sublime's version of Jailhouse, as do I. It's just the best. And Aaron is here. Hi, Aaron. And the emo dad is wondering what happened. YouTube has been waiting for 2 days. Yes, I explained that part already as to why that was. All right, let's move on now. Rick Bond says, I was with them the night before up in Chico. That was one of the most insane, crazy rock and roll shows I've ever seen in my life. There were probably 2,000 people there. The fence got torn down. Security was overwhelmed. Eric Wilson says, it was in the park with a traveling circus. All these people with tattoos and piercings, the freak show thing. Rick Bond says, at one point I saw an opening in the crowd and I thought someone had gotten hurt and gone down. So I jumped off the stage right in the middle of this crowd and there was nothing there, but everyone was looking on the ground. I'm like, what are we looking for? And some guy yells out, a finger, a fucking finger. And I'm like, what do you mean a finger? So we're all there looking around for a guy's finger. I mean, like, that's the best. Like, these are the best parts of like oral histories. Like, really, that is like, those are the best parts of oral histories, because you just get crazy shit, like crazy recollections like that. Eric Wilson says, in Chico, there were a lot of drugs. We stayed over at some college girl's house and smoked crack for breakfast. So it wasn't really surprising that that's where Brad found his last bag. Now, there's a bunch of different theories or whatever you want to call it. And again, I'm not here to say any of this is correct or incorrect. I don't know. But there's like this rumor that you would read about on the internet that there was like a suitcase from a promoter. It was a suitcase full of drugs. They'll probably talk about it in this thing. But clearly Brad was not sober. Here's the main takeaway, is that a week after marrying Troy, roughly, and, you know, he has an 11-month-old son, Jacob, Brad is getting loaded. And we've already talked about, in one of the earliest shows we did on Sublime, Paul Leary talks about a recollection of Brad. This was when they were just getting ready to do the record. Before they did the record, Brad wanted to borrow $10,000 from Paul Leary. I wonder why. You know what I mean? So, I mean, I think even when Brad would put together weeks of sobriety, he was a mess. The guy was a friggin' mess, man. He was. You gotta call it what it is. And, so they're talking about, they were smoking crack. The Sublime was essentially, according to Eric, they were smoking crack for breakfast. And he says, so it wasn't really surprising that that's where Brad found his last bag. So there was, okay. So what I was saying is that there was a suitcase full of drugs and it was given to Brad, or somebody had a suitcase and that's where Brad got the bag, something like that. And that it had happened in Chico the night before. It was not, he didn't necessarily get the drugs at the Phoenix Theater show. That he had it, he was holding on to it or something. Rick Bond says, at the after party, Brad came up to Mitch, who was the bodyguard we had hired to protect Brad from himself. Brad walked up and said, give me some money. And Mitch was like, no, I'm not giving you any money. And Brad got really upset and was like, it's my money. Give me my fucking money. And Mitch was like, I'm not going to give you any money, because we all knew what that was about. But the unfortunate thing is that Brad did not need money to score. You know what I mean? So I'm convinced that he got it that night. So I'm talking about the Chico at Chico. And that's where like the suitcase comes from or something. Here's a ticket for the final show, which had Filibuster and the Ziggins, which was the brother band of Sublime. And it says, no drugs or alcohol, please, on the ticket. I wonder why. Wow. $12 to see Sublime at their final show. Who would have thought, man? Eric Wilson says, I slept hungover on the way to Petaluma, and so did anybody else that was in the van. We had a big old junker motorhome and we had our own bunks. That was like a tour bus to us. Boots Houston, who was the manager at the Maritime Hall. We had him at the Maritime once before, and we had him at the Phoenix a couple of times. They were kind of wild and crazy. Bradley was a little bit out of control, but he wasn't a bad person or anything. I liked him. I thought he was cool. I think that really, again, like I said, I don't know Brad, and I really feel like I need to do a disclaimer every time I try to talk about this stuff because I don't want to sound like I know what I'm talking about. I'm just a guy on the internet trying to understand this. I'm just trying to figure it out, right? It says Brad was a little bit out of control, but he wasn't a bad person or anything. I liked him. I thought he was cool. Maybe that's a great way from what I've read. Maybe that's a good way to kind of sum up maybe what Brad was if you didn't get a chance to meet him or know him, right? Like if you have to read about it on the internet, maybe that's kind of like a somewhat of an accurate appraisal of the situation. I don't know. I really don't know. So they were booked at the Phoenix one night and the Maritime the next night. This is Ree Smith Guerrero. I was 19. A bunch of dudes were going. My best friend had just met a guy, and his roommates were all like, let's go see Sublime. So I hopped in with the roommates, and I left her behind with her boyfriend, which she still regrets to this day. Josh Drake. Josh Drake says, Earth Crisis played at the Phoenix with the metal band I was in, and they were maybe 6 people there. But whenever there was a big ska show at the Phoenix, Let's Go Bowling, Skankin' Pickle, Real Big Fish, lots of people would go to the ska shows. So you would just go to whatever show it was. Yeah, people in the 90s were stoked on ska. And it's funny. I saw like a meme the other day. It was like ska music is kind of like what a kid hears, like a young boy hears when he gets an extra mozzarella stick. And I thought that was really funny. Because, it's funny, like people like shit on ska. A lot of people like, it fell out of popularity, it became very uncool to like ska. And I wonder if that's because there's some bands and there are some like scenes or, musical genres that have like really cringe fan bases. And I wonder if there's a lot of people who feel that way. I know people feel that way about like Misfit Samhain Danzig fan base, of which I'm a part of. I'm a Misfit Samhain Danzig fan, but I know that it's kind of like there's a lot of people that kind of feel cringe about like the diehard fans. If you're like a casual Misfits fan, that's cool, but like the diehard Misfit fans that it's kind of like they're kind of goofballs. These are my people, by the way. I mean, I love them, but that's kind of like there's like a stigma there or something. I feel like there's a stigma with ska too, to an extent. Little Mike says, everybody'd be singing along and know all the words, even if there wasn't a record out. They just had a contagious enthusiasm. I had never seen anything like that. I think contagious enthusiasm is what happens when you are just super passionate about what you're doing. Tom Gaffey says, this was their 3rd show there. The first time they came in, it was as the support band, and they absolutely stole the show. So we brought them back on their own 2 more times. Their guarantee in those days was probably 1,500 plus back end. In those days, back end was still at 70%. So I guess back end was like, is that similar to like what the door was, or is that like the door and the bar? 1,500 is, I guess, for a gigging band without label support is probably not bad. I don't know. Boots Houston says they probably got $3,000. Rick Bond says, I would guess their guarantee was probably in the 2,500 range. And right now they would be playing for no less than 250 or 500,000 a night. So, and right now they'd be, so he's saying if they had never broken up and they had continued to get bigger, I mean, who knows? You know, what's funny? Sublime self-titled sells 17 million copies when counting. Maybe they were just warming up. Maybe Sublime was just warming up. Maybe, and again, we're just playing, we're fantasizing, we're approximating. Who knows, man? Who knows? Is it possible that, Sublime's next record would be even bigger than this one? Would they have found a formula that really worked for them in the studio in the way that they were able to work with Paul Leary and, get to a place where like, oh my God, we know how to make like commercial music in this bubble. In the same way that No Doubt, Return to Saturn was a huge hit for No Doubt. That was their follow-up to Tragic Kingdom, and Tragic Kingdom was as big of a record, if not bigger, than Sublime self-titled. I mean, it was a huge freaking record for No Doubt. It's kind of amazing that both of these bands exploded out of the same musical scene, right? And obviously other bands paved the way for that to happen in alternative music. No Doubt, Nirvana paved the way for Dookie, and Dookie kind of paved the way for every other kind of alternative, for the Offspring, right? And, in turn, self-titled and Tragic Kingdom. And I'm sure somebody might argue that that's not exactly the right lineage, but I don't know, kind of makes sense to me. But what would have been Sublime's Return to Saturn? Do you know what I'm saying? Like if the self-titled record had its own Return to Saturn, so they could have been even bigger. So the idea of them playing for $250,000 or $500,000 a night, maybe it's not so far off. I don't know what kind of guarantees, whatever guarantees No Doubt we're getting around Return to Saturn. How about that? And I don't know what those guarantees were. Tom, if someone could figure that out, though, that'd be very interesting. I'd be very curious to know what kind of guarantees No Doubt was getting in the late 90s, post Tragic Kingdom, post Return to Saturn. That would be an interesting number to have. And I'm sure it's out there on the internet. Someone could approximate it. Tom Gaffey says, here's one of the differences that I noticed. The first couple of times that they came through, they get here early, they do their sound check, and then they'd hang out with all the skater kids. The skater kids would be going onto their RV and watching videos with them and hanging out. The last time through, the RV was not open to skaters. They were not hanging out as much. Bradley wasn't skating with the kids like he had before. That was the first sign that something was a little bit wrong. But my question rhetorically is, was it? Because, if Brad, or if like at that time, the awareness of Brad's drug problem and the fact that they had a guy named Mitch, the bodyguard Mitch, trying to prevent Brad from, getting loaded because he couldn't help himself or whatever. So maybe like the idea of something being a little bit wrong, maybe it was a little bit wrong, but maybe it was also like, this is how we're keeping Brad from like destroying himself. And before, when it was open to skater kids, not to say that the skater kids were the reason, but that, that was when the band was, just openly getting loaded. I don't know. Work that we do. Jason Boggs from Filibuster says, it was the Ziggins, us, and Sublime. We had a 27-foot 1967 school bus that we took around on tour. So we rolled up in that, and all the guys from the band hung out in there. That was like our little backstage party zone. Holly Simmons, I guess this was just a concert goer. I remember lots of frat boys, which was weird for the Phoenix and the crowd that usually went there. It was never the college boys. It was the punk rock skaters. It was the punk rockers and skaters. I went with my girlfriends. So here is the inside of the Phoenix today. I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this. You see this? So that's what it looked like. That's where Sublime played their last show. Let me make this a little bit bigger. That's kind of like what it looked like. I wonder what happens when I do this. Yeah, there you go. Oh, sweet. We can get a little bit bigger here. All right. So that's what it looked like. And I guess it's been kind of turned into like a skate park. See this ramp over here? I don't think that used to be there, but that was the final stage that Sublime played on. Right. Let's share this tab instead. Tyson Engel says, Brad was hanging out with people out front. He was excited with the new record coming out. I gave him a cigarette, but I didn't really talk to him that much. Holly Simmons says, I thought it was incredibly cool that before they played, Brad was in the crowd drinking and hanging out. So he was drinking. So, I mean, he was not sober, man. The guy was getting loaded again. Eric Wilson, and mind you, he had gotten really bad when they were recording the record and they had to send him home to clean him up. Eric Wilson says, I remember before the show, it was in the Bay Area with a college crowd and there were some guys discussing politics. I said what I thought about it, which wasn't much, and the guy put me down for a couple of minutes in a really intelligent way. Wait, I remember before the show, I was in the Bay Area with a college crowd, and there were some guys discussing politics. I said what I thought about it. I thus referring to the politics, which wasn't much. And then the guy put me down for a couple of minutes in a really intelligent. So the guy was breaking things down for Eric in a really intelligent way. Josh Drake says, the way that the Phoenix used to get when there were tons of people in there, it was so hot that you had to try and crane your head up to get fresh air. With the crowd and the heat, it was tough to breathe. Holly Simmons says, it was an awesome concert and a huge party. The energy level was just insane. Jason Boggs says from Filibuster, Sublime killed it that night. They did a great, and mind you, the record, their new self-titled record before it was self-titled, was supposed to be called Killing It, which was, I guess, a colloquialism, right, for just doing a really great job, right? Sublime killed it that night. They did a really great job considering how much we'd all been partying before the show. I was very, very impressed in how tight they sounded. Tom Gaffey says, I think I read somewhere that said he'd called home and said he was having the best show that he ever had. I don't want to go against what common belief is, but I do recall that I was kind of bored with that show. I'm sorry to say that. It just didn't have the energy that the other shows had. I mean, like, and again, I appreciate what Tom's saying. Like, I like hearing this stuff because it's sort of, you know, again, it paints the perspective of like particular person's point of view of history. Oral histories are the best for this reason, you know. Sarah Sugaru says, I recall feeling sheer disappointment. I thought that it sounded awful, especially Brad. I felt a little bad saying it, but being that he's passed. So I guess Tom wasn't alone in his belief, and this Sarah person agrees with him. Drew Hirschfeld says, it was my second time seeing them, and I just remember Brad looking just awful. He was smoking lots of cigarettes during the set. Josh Drake says, when Sublime was on, I went up to the balcony where they had a fire escape sorry, I am just sucking at reading tonight. Let me try that again. When Sublime was on, I went up to the balcony where they had the fire escape doors open and you could get some fresh air. And of course, there were some guys with big army jackets standing around, clearly smoking weed, and me sliding up to them, trying to stand in the circle, hoping that they'd pass it to me. It was gross tasting wood. It was a gross tasting wooden pipe that everyone's mouth had been on. It was disgusting. It sounds disgusting. Tom Gaffey says, in those days, it was acceptable behavior. Nowadays, our rules are stricter and stricter. The party finally ate us up. Jared Powell says, I left the show. I was like, whatever, I'll see them play again. Wow. Could you imagine thinking that? And then, my God. Drew Hirschfeld, you know who's absent from this thing, and maybe he won't be later. No Bud Gaw. Bud Gaw has not spoken. Mind you, this is 2016. Bud is kind of, I don't know where Bud is in 2016. Kind of not around, I don't think, much. I don't think he was doing, I don't know what he was doing at that point. He had some side bands. He did fill in the blanks, Del Mar. Oh, that, I think like that was earlier. Drew Hirschfeld says, it was a show I was stoked about because I had been a real fan. And then there was something worrisome and sadly disconnected about the band. So everybody who's seen the show that's being interviewed, this thing was not stoked about the show. Eric Wilson says, it was a hit and miss thing for us. We used to drink a lot. A lot of my older acquaintances would say, I would never know if you guys were going to sound like total shit or play great. We didn't have our professional skills going on back then. We just thought the world was ours or whatever. I think that's a very interesting sort of accurate attitude, right? It's like this notion of, you know, this cocky notion of we're young, invincible, everything's going to be great. I don't know, yada, yada, yada. Jason Boggs says, They had half pipes at the front. It was almost like a rec center the way it was set up. So I guess they did have skating back then too. Holly Simmons says there were pro skateboarders skating on the ramps when they were playing, and people were just going nuts. I want to say that Mike Carroll was one of them. My friends I was with, they were more in awe of the skateboarders than the band itself. Ree Smith Guerrero says, I stayed in the back. I remember that the pit was pretty rowdy. I was being a little more cautious than I would have been in the past couple of years prior to that. I had pit injuries. You got to play nice in the pit. Sarah says, there was this one guy that I couldn't take my eyes off of. I recall him being dressed in all black and wearing a skirt, and he had decided to dance ballet style in the pit. He would pirouette. He would pirouette through some macho douchebags that were pushing people around, and he looked so free without a care in the world of what others thought. Faith Corian Valdez says, I just remember their Dalmatian running around. Eric Wilson says, Lou Dog running around on stage. That was typical. Yeah, he probably bit somebody too. We know that Lou Dog would sit right in front of the amp and be unfazed as they would play, right? Little Mike says, Sublime would give you 10 copies of their records and be like, give these to your bros. Let people know about this. And you know, it's funny. There's a collector's market now for Sublime stuff. And I bet you though, all those copies are probably worth a lot of money. Right. I still have Josh Drake says, I still have a cassette tape, a Skunk Record sampler that I think the Ziggins threw out into the crowd. Wait, where did I see that thing? Oh yeah, I skipped over thing. My friend was up in front. I guess he buddied up to this big, burly, muscly black dude who was their merch guy, and so he left with a bunch of stickers, pins, and T-shirts and stuff. And that stuff is probably also worth a lot of money. Holly Simmons says we snuck backstage, which was amazing for us, in our Oshkosh overalls and really curly hair, with a Mickey's 40-ounce poured into a big gulp cup. I was 19. There was lots of weed and it was crowded. We just stood there in the corner in awe, drinking out of our 7-Eleven big gulps full of beer. Eric Wilson said it was always a scene backstage. We had our guard down, so we didn't see what Brad was up to. I mean, it sounds like, if everybody was smoking weed backstage, it wasn't a sober environment to begin with. And I mean, that's always going to be a problem for anybody who's recovering. Here's a very sad photo of one of the final photos of Brad ever. Okay, apparently this is the last known photograph of Bradley Nowell ever taken, which we have as a thumbnail as well. Let's take a look at that for a second. As sad as it is to look at it. Let me see if I can make this enlarge, computer enlarge, computer enhance, computer enhance. He does look tired, man. He looks exhausted. He doesn't look, I don't know. You know, they say that he was stoked and happy that he played a great show, but does it show here? I don't know. It's funny how someone tells you something or someone tells you their POV, and then you can like look at a photograph and then mirror it to everything else that was being said. And it's like, you know, everything that's needs to be said is said right in this photograph, you know? So that's kind of interesting too. The last known photograph of Bradley Nowell. It's crazy. Tom, so waking up to an alarm. Tom Gaffey says, Rick Bond called me the next day and said, Tom, I want you to know this wasn't your fault. I said, what are you talking about? What a way to start a new chapter too. Could you imagine getting that phone call? Tom, I want you to know that this wasn't your fault. My fucking Lord. What a thing to say. That is insanity. Eric Wilson says, I was in the motorhome. We woke up to have Bloody Marys. I sent my friend inside the hotel to get some ice for the Bloody Marys, and he came back frantically crying. Imagine you wake up, Eric Wilson wakes up that morning, and he's like, I'm got a brand new album in the can. We're about to embark for our first European tour. The world is our oyster. And he sends somebody out for Bloody Mary, for ice for Bloody Marys. And when he comes back with the ice, his entire life has changed. his entire life has changed forever. Obviously, Eric Wilson is still alive. Like Bradley Nowell lost his life. But it's just the idea, like, look at how everybody was affected by this one person dying. That's the other part of the Sublime story that's so tragically sad, besides the fact that Bradley lost his life. Look at how many people's lives were tragically, irreversibly changed because he passed away, because he died, and because he, did what he did. I mean, look, first and foremost, look at, Jake and Troy. Their lives were irrevocably changed forever. Bradley, Eric Wilson, Bud Ga, I mean, just everybody's life changed that day because their friend died, because he was the heart and soul of the band. They couldn't do the band without him. I mean, it's so insanely like sad and tragic and crazy and frustrating and agonizing to think about. Ree Smith Guerrero says, I was at my parents' house and I woke up and poured myself a bowl of cereal and was sitting in front of MTV. And then the MTV news splash was Bradley Nowell, dead at 28, died in San Francisco. I just about spewed my cereal. Rick Bond says, Bud Ga, Sublime drummer, found him. What I had heard is that Lou Dog was on the bed licking Brad's face. Bud looked at him and there was zero question. Lou was licking vomit off of him. His face was green colored. There was no saving him. Obviously, it was over. So fucking sad, dude. Just very, 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 very sad. I mean, I can imagine. And it's interesting. Bud has talked. I mean, Bud was there. Bud was, there's, supposedly Bud got loaded with him. I can't imagine what goes through Bud Ga's mind. I can't possibly imagine all of the emotions and feelings that he must feel, just in a variety of different ways. Boots Houston says, at first I thought it was bullshit. I thought somebody was pulling my leg. That's the kind of band that they were, always goofing off. Tell the Maritime promoter that Brad died and that he won't give us any shit for missing sound check. That's what I was thinking. But then this girl I talked to who was hanging with the band, she got real serious and real quiet. She said, no, man, he's not here anymore. And, again, like, this is 1996. You can't just go. I guess if you were able to tune into the MTV news broadcast, but like, you can't go on Twitter to check to see if this is real, right? Like, you can't go on like onto Facebook and see all the statuses of like RIP Bradley Nowell. You can't go to Reddit. That stuff does not exist. So it's like the amount of confusion. And there were people for years and years afterwards, that I came up at this time, right? There were so many people, nobody knew that he was dead. People didn't even know that he was dead. People were discovering Sublime and had no idea that Bradley Nowell had died. It's crazy. Eric Wilson says, it killed a part of me. I don't really like talking about it. I can understand why. In the Portrait of a Punk book, Crazy Fool, Eric talks about a friend Eric had lost a friend to heroin before, and he was very concerned about Brad and had, put up protests, and it had become a point of contention between the two of them, at one point. Right. So it's like, it's just so sad, dude. It's just so unbelievably sad. So between Eric and Bud, like, the idea, I mean, these guys really are survivors. I mean, they survived like this insane thing. They survived their band like imploding because their friend died. Jason Boggs says, from what I heard, there was a bunch of people in San Francisco that got the same batch. There were a bunch of ODs that night. I mean, you hear about stuff. I don't know if this would fall into the category, but you hear about, maybe it's different in the 90s, but more recently, and I believe, I don't know, it's intentional, it's unintentional. There's something, there's this thing called a hot shot, and what a hot shot is, it's a bag that is, it's meant to kill. And there are bags out there. Sometimes they're if depending on what, you're stepping on your product with, depending on what, there's a variety of different factors. But sometimes there's like because this stuff is not government regulated. And this is where, again, I don't want to get political and I don't want to go on and on about this, but I will just say this. Like there really is something to government regulation of drugs, of recreational drugs. This is where you do want some sort of organized interference to maintain a certain quality to what people are taking, because it can save lives. It keeps people from dying. And, obviously this gets a whole lot more insane, because then you start talking about fentanyl and, oh my God, fuck. When you think about like, people, it's funny, back in the day, it used to always like hear these, I don't know if you call them folk tales, or like these stories of consequence of people smoking weed, and it was laced with LSD, and the kid thinks that he's a glass of orange juice and he can't be tipped over, just like all sorts of boogeyman tells, right? It's like, that's what it is. It's like something to scare you straight. But the reality is like, that's not the reality today. The reality today is like, you could smoke weed that's laced with fentanyl very easily. Someone might, put fentanyl in something to make it more potent, and they might use too much, and you will die. You'll die, and you won't even, and there's so many people. And I, like, again, qualifying in the situation, I know so many people who have died from fentanyl. I do. I know tons of them. I know a bunch of people who have died from fentanyl. It's such a serious thing. It's such a minefield out there, and so there's this idea, again, to get outside of the fentanyl thing. There's this idea, it's called the hot shot. And basically it's a bag that's meant to kill you, intentionally or unintentionally. And, but in this case, whether this was a hot shot or not, it was something. It was a batch that led to a bunch of ODs that night, and particularly for Brad, who hadn't done, who might have been smoking crack or doing whatever else he was doing, drinking, but hadn't done heroin in a very long time, or in a long enough time that his tolerance was low. And whether he was using the brown stuff or the China white, who knows. That some people say he was using he used the same dose that he always did, but he just had been clean for a while, or clean off of heroin for a while, and that did him in. And some people said that the stuff that he did the same amount that he normally did, but it was China white, which is something he never did, and that's what did him in. And ultimately, who knows? And then he was doing speedballs, and he took the heroin to come down. Who knows, man? Who friggin' knows? Drew Hirschfeld says, the next day during recess at Montgomery High, my pal John told me he had heard about the overdose. I was shocked and a bit scared. I think we felt sacredly important that we were at their last show, because we were a bunch of 17-year-old punks. Josh Drake says, it was on the news, and then I got that kind of excitement that I was part of the news, like I was at that show. I know that's insane. Taking someone's death and turning it into a win. Yeah, it is insane. It's terrible. When you're that age and nothing ever happens to you, it was like at least some excitement in our small town. I mean, I would be embarrassed to share that. Like, I would never want that on the public record, whether that's real or not. Like, if that's truly how you felt, like, you should keep that to yourself and like let that be a lesson to you. That's my own 2 cents, obviously. Tom Gaffey says, 3 or 4 creepy downtown denizens in town tried to claim responsibility. That is sick. They tried to say that they were the ones that sold him the drugs as a source of pride. How ghoulish is that? Ghoulish doesn't even begin to classify it. What a bunch of idiots. And I was the only one who had heard stuff like that. It's like, is that your stupid way of at least being able to say that you were a part of history? That's how you want to be known, as the guy who sold Bradley Nowell the drugs? Ree Smith Guerrero says, I had heard a lot of rumors about where the drugs came from. I heard people say, yeah, my friend was the guy that sold them the dope and all that. It sounded like a lot of exaggeration and rumor. Jared Powell says, everybody says that they know someone who did something. There are rumors that seem plausible, but it's also coming from people who want to hang on to some celebrity moment, and that's just scumbaggy anyway. Totally. Ree Smith Guerrero says the rumors were nasty about who was trying to boast about it. Ricky Bond says, I'm convinced that he got it in Chico, and here's my theory. So here's the theory that Rick Bond says. It's a shame that we did not. It kind of bums me out that I wish Bud had talked here. And, that was the one thing that I kind of hated a little bit about that Sublime documentary. Maybe there's a lot of political reasons that Bud, that stuff was grossly omitted. But it kind of also does a disservice to his death by not just telling the truth of what happened, in that they just sort of sanitized what had happened or Bud's involvement there. But here's Rick Bond's theory. I think that Brad knew he was going to be home seeing his wife and baby in a few days. I think that he had gotten high that night and probably decided he just needed to finish it off so he wasn't tempted to do it the next day, so he could clean up for a couple of days before he needed to see his family. That's been my gut this whole time, and believe me, I thought about it a million times in the last 20 years. I mean, it sounds entirely feasible. It sounds like it could be an Occam's razor. Who knows? Look at all the love that we found. Here's the thing, is the final chapter. Boots Houston says their fans were incredible. When the show at Maritime was canceled, instead of freaking out and demanding refunds, they just came and were like really sad. They didn't care about the money they paid for the tickets. I probably only refunded 10 or 20 people out of 1,500 tickets sold. Usually when something like that happens, people start to demand their money back right at the door. It wasn't like that. People were just sad that it happened. The whole space in front of the hall turned into a makeshift wake for Bradley. Tom Gaffey says, in the next 5 to 10 years, we were getting a lot of people coming through and taking pictures of the place. That's dropped off, of course. Rick Bond says, the president of MCA Records met with me about a month later. I was in his office and he told me he was not going to release the record. He said, I'm done, Rick. I can't do this. I've spent $500,000 on Brad's rehab, and now we don't have a band to tour behind it. I'm just going to shelve it. It's not going to work. It's never going to be successful. I was like, I'm not leaving until you promise to put out this record. I wouldn't let up on him. And like 20 minutes later, he was finally like, okay, I'll try it. I'll put it out and see what happens. And now, how many millions of records later? Now, Rick Bond wants to take responsibility for that, but hold the phone. Hold the phone. Hold the phone. Yeah, hold on. Donkey Konging says China White is fentanyl and it wasn't around back then. I don't think you're right at all about that. And I never did heroin personally. Fentanyl is not, it's not heroin the way that China White is heroin. China White is heroin, and it's like a really pure heroin. I think fentanyl is something slightly different. I'm not going to say I know definitively. I guess maybe we should just look it up. I don't believe, now we got to look this up. Hold on. I don't know why we have to look this up. Fentanyl. Yeah, no. I knew you had this wrong. Fentanyl is a potent synthetic opioid drug approved by the Food and Drug Administration for use as an as a pain relief and anesthetic. Okay, and then China White. I mean, dude, you ever heard of the Grateful Dead song from the 70s? China. Oh shit. China White is slang for fentanyl. But wait a minute. Fentanyl. Hold on a second. All right. Maybe I'm fucking wrong. I'm wrong. What? No. Telescope says fentanyl is stronger than heroin, and nitazine. I never even heard of nitazine. Is stronger than fentanyl. Yeah, but fentanyl is newer. Hold on a second. Is China White different Hey, if I'm wrong, man, I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure I'm not. Is China White different from fentanyl? China White, what you need to know about the heroin, like, oh, damn. No, China White heroin. It's fall and it's rise again. Yeah. Hold on a second. Is China White? I mean, there's literally like 5 different people I could call right now who would give me a definitive answer right now. Wait a minute. I'm looking this up, you guys. China White heroin. It's fall and rise again. What is China White heroin? Throughout the years, many different types of fentanyl analogs have existed. When you look at the history of the term China White heroin, aka heroin, fentanyl, and furanol, go back to the 60s where they coined the term to describe the heroin that was brought. I knew it. Okay, I was not wrong. So China White heroin, that goes back to the 60s, and it was a term to describe the heroin that was brought into the United States from China. This became a slang term in the early 80s. In the early 80s, it was merely another name for heroin. And then I knew it. Fentanyl came a lot later. Okay. Yeah. Fentanyl analogs and China White heroin. Fentanyl is the most common drug sold. It's so, okay. So fentanyl can be sold as China White heroin, but it's synthetic. Whereas China White heroin is not synthetic. It's made from actual opiates. Okay. So that's the difference here. There are many different adverse effects of China White heroin introduced in 1988. China White. Okay. And then there's another. Okay. So another one was introduced in 1988. China White contains fentanyl in 1988. But again, China White goes back to the 60s. And then you have the Grateful Dead song, China Cat Sunflower. And that's all about China White. Jerry Garcia was all about the China White. So, and Jerry Garcia was never doing fentanyl. Just going to double check that right now. Jerry, listen, when I get things wrong, I admit it, but I don't think I'm wrong here. Fentanyl. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I'm not going to say blah, 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 blah. Yeah, no. Jerry Garcia wasn't doing fentanyl. So Donkey, China White was around. China White was around in the 60s. Eddie's here. Eddie, did you make your list yet? God damn it. Make your list so we can do the show, and tell Reed to do the same. Eddie got to see the Petaluma show. He got to actually watch the show we're talking about. So Eddie's seen it. Telescope says xylazine, or whatever the hell this is called, is big on the East Coast. It's called Trank. It's a mixture of fentanyl and xylazine. It's Narcan resistant. That's terrifying. Telescope says all the fentanyl comes from Mexico. It used to be produced in China, but it was outlawed a few years ago. The analogs are still produced in China. Yeah, but the point is that China White is another term for really pure heroin before fentanyl ever was in the picture. That's what I'm trying to differentiate here. Eddie says, FYI, the Play Nice in the Pit we have the audio for is incomplete. That's right. And the last song is Work That We Do, which is really cool, and did not know that. All right, let's continue reading on here. Okay. Now, Rick Bond says here, Rick Bond is saying that he's the guy who convinced the president of MCA Records to put out the album that was formerly known as Killing It. And that's not true. Or at least that's not what I've heard. What happened was Miguel, there were 3 back then. It was very, very expensive to make CD masters. And Miguel had one of them, or he had 2 of them or something. And Miguel brought it to K-Rock, and he gave that CD master to one of the guys at K-Rock to play. And that's what jump-started it. Okay. That's what jump-started it. I'm curious to hear what Eddie thinks about that. Eddie, how did Sublime self-titled break? What broke it? What broke it? Was it Rick? Was Rick the one who convinced the president of MCA Records, or was it Miguel? No disrespect to Rick. I'm just saying, I've heard this. It's, again, like success has many fathers. You know what I mean? So everybody's, again, in the same way that people take credit for giving Brad the bad bag. Say that 5 times. Giving Brad the bad bag. Giving Brad the bad bag. Giving Brad the bad bag. Rick Bond also took those high-quality pics from that night before Chico. Telescope says, as far as I know, China White was always referred to as heroin. Exactly. Language changes, that's true, but Bradley was on heroin and not fentanyl. Fentanyl didn't really come into the scene until 5. Right. I first started hearing about fentanyl in like the late 2010s, and I started to know people dying from fentanyl around that time. So I don't know. Eddie says, Rick Bond said they will go down in history for being the worst A&R if they don't release the album. Okay. All right. Sorry, Rick. I guess maybe there's something there. I just always thought it was Miguel who really was the one who pushed for that. John Phillips from Silverback Management also told the label that they wanted to put it out to radio and CD. So, it's a good thing that they did. Josh Drake says, I was into punk bands and more underground music. So in that scene, we all rejected Sublime once the big album came out, and the horrible scarring of the musical landscape they caused by telling bands it was okay to play this crappy reggae music. Because Sublime there were 1,000 bands. There were so many bands that came out afterwards, all trying to do the Sublime thing. And none of it sounds good, man. None of it sounds good. I don't want to I'm not going to slag any particulars, but, I don't know, man. Apparently there's 2 camera angles of Petaluma that exist, according to Eddie here. West Coast for Life says, what trips me out is that Brad wanted to party still, but Bud pinched his stash and did dope by himself and fell asleep. Weird. Yeah, I mean that's what Bud has talked about that. He's talked about that. I don't know if that he pinched from the stash or that they did it together or something like that. I don't know. I do not know. Yeah, Eddie, we were talking about Albino Brown earlier, and there's like this, I guess there was a lawsuit or something. There was some sort of discrepancy. And why did Bud disappear during the 40 ounce hour? Because he was in rehab. He was in a Christian like motorcycle rehab, and he sort of had to dry out. He had to dry out and and that's when they brought in Marshall. That's when Marshall came to play drums, and then Kelly. And let's keep reading here. Jared Powell says, now everyone says that they were at that show. If everybody who says that they were at that show was actually at that show, it would have been thousands of people. Tom Gaffey says, the other guys came back here a few years later with the Long Beach Dub All-Stars and painted a mural backstage for Brad. That's nice. Eric Wilson says, that would have been done by Opie, the singer. He's the guy who drew the sun on 40 Ounces of Freedom. He's a tattoo artist. And he also designed a tribute tattoo for both Eric and Bud of Brad. Tom Gaffey says, it lasted forever until last year when some idiot came and painted a mural over it. Are you fucking kidding me? What idiot would paint over a mural like that? Jared Powell says that Tom went ape shit. And he started screaming and yelling at this young little 18-year-old graffiti writer that didn't know what was going on, was almost in tears. But it's funny. You could imagine, after hearing about like Bradley painting a Hitler mustache on Willie Nelson in Austin, Texas, you could imagine that Sublime doing something ridiculous like that too. So I don't know. Tom says that was a painful thing. It was a beautiful piece. I'd invite them to come back and redo it because I'd love to have it back. That would be nice. Jim Agius. You know what's interesting? The fact that they don't have Bud gone of others that were there, like Z-Man or whoever else was there. It's kind of cool because you're hearing these smaller perspectives that you just wouldn't get to hear otherwise. So this guy, Jim, who's the Phoenix Theater in-house promoter, says there's actually audio from the show out there on the internet. The story I heard was that a girl recorded it from the balcony with a Walkman. She and her boyfriend put it out on CD with money that she made as a stripper. Eric Wilson says, I haven't heard that recording. Did we sound good? I hope we sounded good. That's amazing that in 2016, Eric Wilson still hasn't heard the last show, Play Nice in the Pit, which I feel like is something like everybody has. And look, there's a cassette. Little Mike says it wasn't great audio quality, but yeah, she had this little Walkman, a handheld thing. You can hear the whole thing on the internet because I gave the tape to these internet guys after a while. They were just hounding me. It's called Played Nice in the Pit because that's what it was painted, because that's what was painted on the wall of the Phoenix. And don't you love it? I love it when friggin' how bootlegs get their names and stuff. I mean, that's really fun, interesting sort of history. So I didn't realize that about Play Nice in the Pit. We put some of the better sounding songs out on a CD called, which everybody has this one too. It All Seems So Silly in the Long Run, with some other recordings we had done at Club Commotion. Club Commotion is actually there are some really clean recordings of Sublime. In fact, I believe that it all seems so silly in the long run is actually the basis for what eventually will become Stand By Your Van. If I'm not mistaken, that's the Commotion show. Could be wrong. Bud and Eric, and I sent them $1,000 each, talking about Bud and Eric. Bud and Eric told me that it was the most money they had gotten for their music at that point. Their album was out and selling millions, but they hadn't seen any money because they owed so much money to MCA for Brad's rehab. They were in $1 million in debt, Sublime was. And, obviously that all changed, but it took very, very long time for that to happen. So the only royalty check they ever saw, because it had cost Brad's rehab, it cost $500,000. The only royalty check they had received at that point was from a bootleg. Isn't that crazy? Jim says the other thing is that there's video footage of the whole show, but that's never been released. I mean, that's what Eddie was talking about, that in the comments here. There's two angles. One is from a guy, Albino Brown, and then there's the other guy, Josh, R.I.P., who died. And yeah, they're just they've sat on this footage all these years, not doing anything with it. Eric Wilson says, I'm sure it'll come out sometime, but I don't know anything about the politics of it. Sarah says, it's also where I first met my ex, on the stairs of the Phoenix. Initially, I was planning to say that it was the night I could have done without. However, without that night and the next few years of hell with my ex, I may never have been at Gale's, that one night where I met my amazing husband. 17 years together. Blah, blah, blah. Sorry, 17 years together this year. So with that thought, I am so happy that I had this disastrous night in my history. If I didn't go to that show, I honestly would not be who I am now. Holly Simmons says, I remember telling my husband, I was at their last show when a Sublime song came on the radio when we were driving to Disneyland with our kids. He's like, no, you weren't. And I was like, no, they played their last show at the Phoenix. Boots Houston says, I really didn't expect it to happen. Bradley, he was crazy and partying, but I just never got the vibe that he was going to check out like that. Rick Bond says, you know what was really going through my mind after he died? I swear this is true. That as sad as I was for myself and for my business, and obviously for Brad's wife and family and the band, the thing that I thought about most was that the rest of the world didn't know what they had just lost. Jason Boggs says, I think Bradley would have gotten a lot more seasoned. I think he might have started to realize that he was a voice. He never got a chance to see how much influence he had on people or how his music affected people in such a good way. He brought that positivity that I think he understood about reggae and rocksteady and even punk rock. He was a very positive person. And, the fact of the matter is, even though he didn't have to, his son has picked up and carried his carried on his father's work. Eric Wilson says he'd probably be playing music, probably with me, but he might have gone solo. But who knows? We'll never know. I imagine that Bradley Nowell would have gone solo eventually. I think that maybe Sublime would still go on, but eventually, like kind of like how Gwen Stefani does, like Gwen Stefani. I feel like there just would have been Bradley Nowell. There would have been like a Bradley Nowell solo show or something. Eddie says Ska Parade received death threats back in the late 90s because they didn't hand over tapes. That's crazy. Eddie says, however, I believe they did cut 4 songs and send it to Westfall, but they said they never got it. Tape ended up in Europe. And the guy, Little Mike, it was his girlfriend who recorded it, by the way. And it took years for Bud and Eric to get paid. Eddie says Bud released a statement on MySpace back in 2007 or so saying that when a band generates 300 million and the band only sees 100 million due to everyone and their secretaries and hairdressers, etc. That's really sad. It's fucking sad. It's crazy. And it makes, like, you know what, when you, again, no matter what we think about Sublime with Rome and knowing now what a mistake it was, at that time, I remember being excited. I was excited because I'm going, fuck, these guys never got to do the thing. Brad fucking died on them. You know what I mean? They never got to do their fucking thing. And like now here, they have this opportunity to do their thing. Like, fuck you, let them do it. Like, let them go to Europe. Let them taste the success they never got to taste because their bandmate died, you know? And obviously that got very fucking stale. You know, they got very stale and very cheesy and terrible. But initially, at the very beginning, it was exciting. It was exciting because it was like, you know what? We're never going to get anything better than this. There's never anything is going to come along. Fuck it. Whatever. The 2 dudes are still around. They want to play Sublime music. You need a guy to get in there and play. And it just so happens that now it happens to be the right guy, right? Jacob is the right guy. I didn't think Jacob was the right guy. I was like, Jacob should just do Law. Like, I like Law. Like, just do your own thing, dude. You don't have to fucking carry your father's ghost. You know what I mean? But that's not what he's fucking doing. It's fucking healing. It's a healing fucking thing. So again, just to wrap this up, this very sad story, again, to go back, like the happy ending of the story, like Brad's gone forever. The band never got to make more music, but the fucking son grew up and fucking picked up the fucking mantle, and like they're going on as Sublime, and it's fucking beautiful, man. It's beautiful. Like, let it be. Great. There's another article here that, I mean, we're 90 minutes in. I really feel like we did the thing. I don't want to sort of dwell any further, but there's an article here that I read, another article from a long time ago, and it's called Sublime played their most powerful song at their last show. And it's a long fucking read, and I really don't feel like doing it right now, so maybe we'll save it for another time. What? This is a member-only story. It didn't used to be, though. All right, so I guess that solves that. He just talks about the summary is the dude talks about the passion of Brad singing the Ballad of Johnny Butt at the final show, and how, you know, I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of sort of like dramatic embellishment in what this guy writes, even though it kind of feels like it comes from like a sincere place. But I guess we don't need to read it because I can't see it. And so that's really the end of that. West Coast says, I refuse to listen to anything Rome Sublime ever. Eddie says, and all the fans defend against this statement, but look at the statistics and the things that happened. Sublime with Rome wasn't even a part of the Sublime documentary in 2019. That says a lot. It is kind of amazing. You would imagine that they would have had, even though he wasn't around back then, you would imagine that you would have the guy, you would have Rome talking on some level about Sublime. Like, you would imagine, just, you know, that is kind of crazy. Yeah, he's whatever. He's cashed. It's all cashed. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. Listen, Eddie, who's in the comments right now, if he can get his act together, Eddie, make it happen, buddy. Eddie and Reed and myself, these guys have done some Sublime stuff with me before. We're going to do a best quote unquote worst and underrated for Sublime's discography, including some of the bootleg records like Pure Anus and Bums Lie, Psychosomatic Police, and Sensimia 86, 96, because even though those aren't like actual records, they're kind of like pseudo band records because the band kind of leaked those recordings. They were signed to Gasoline Alley and they knew that they were going to they knew they were going to the studio, and they like wanted to like they wanted to get a bunch of shit out of their system before they went off to make this record. So they leaked all that stuff. And, God bless, it's one thing to become a Sublime fan after Bradley Nowell dies. And like, you're like kind of on this island of like these 5-ish records, if you want to include Stand By Your Van and Secondhand Smoke. And then to like discover that there are like these bootleg recordings that like have all these like weird snippets and outtakes and like Pass Me the Laser Beam and Roots of Creation and just all this Saw Red Bandolero, like just all this interesting stuff. And you don't even know where half of it comes from or what, like what it is. That was so wonderful. And I discovered all that stuff in like 2002, 2001, 2002. And I was so grateful when I did. And I made a mix called Lord Have This Grilled Cheese. That was my mix. And I just would listen to that. Man, I wore that thing out. And it was just like a sort of a fusion of my favorite songs from those bootleg records. Fighting Blindly, which eventually turned into Burritos, which was like a bedroom recording made by Brad when he was in college or something. All good stuff. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Hope you enjoyed the show. Peace, hair grease. We'll see you next time real soon here at the Frumess channel.